Sometimes it feels like we are swimming, perhaps even drowning in data. Figures coming at you left, right and centre without much in the way of analysis or explanation. And this week, well, frankly, it's been no different. Wages, well, they have apparently outstripped inflation. But is that a good thing? GDP is down by 0.5%. But why? And should we be concerned? Employment is down, unemployment is up. But job vacancies fell beneath 1 million for the first time in 25 months. What on earth is going on there? I'm Niall Paterson, and regular listeners to the Sky News Daily will already be aware that I don't have the answers. But I know a man who does, or who at least pretends to with aplomb, our data and economics editor, Ed Conway. You love these introductions that I give you.
It's all pretense. It's all pretense. No one knows. I think within economics, you shouldn't pretend that you know anything, because even the economists don't know, and everyone listening knows that all of the forecasts won't turn out to be right. But it's just a stab, isn't it? A lot of this supposed expertise, it's educated stabs at where we may be heading, or where, even more importantly, where we are, because he was saying there's loads of data that's come out recently. It's only an imperfect picture of the world as we kind of understand it. And actually, you couldn't have got a better example of that than, I think it was last week, there was a massive kind of swathe of revisions of the picture of the UK economy, GDP numbers, gross domestic product numbers, going back a few years. And it turns out, we thought we were doing really badly, like a massive outlier compared with most of the rest of the developed world. It turns out actually we're doing a lot better than we expected. We're still not that great, frankly, but a lot better than we expected. And all of a sudden, all those presumptions, all of the conventional wisdoms were thrown away. And so, we need to be quite humble, I think. And I hope we can do that, because it's a befuddling world, and I think it's even more befuddling now in the face of all of these crazy things that are happening.
Ed, thank you. And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. No, of course not. Well, look, let's start then, shall we, with gross domestic product. And as you mentioned, there have been revisions. We are expecting other countries perhaps to follow suit in revising their kind of outlook forecast and so on and so forth. But let's talk just the headline figure, down by 0.5%.
Yeah, and that's just in a month. It's been kind of up and down quite a lot recently, but I mean, it's early to say this, but it's possible. Some economists now think it may well be the beginning of a bit of a recession. Now, I don't think that's the conventional view at the moment, and definitely the Bank of England's not talking about a recession. But it comes back to something that we'll probably talk about quite a bit at the moment, which is what the big picture for where we are at the moment. As we all know, interest rates are up. They're up at a rate that we haven't seen since 2009. It's causing a lot of pain. Actually, 2008, I think it is. It's causing a lot of pain. But that pain takes quite a while to feed through. So as of a month or so ago, still only about a third of the full impact on actual mortgages, because obviously the bank does its thing, but then it kind of only filters into your fixed rate mortgage over time. Depends on when you refixed last, depends on how long that fix was. That filters in somewhat erratically into the population. And that means that the pain is dripping through. And I think that a lot of what you're seeing at the moment, if you take a step back, is you're starting to see the impact of some of that pain being felt. And as a result, yes, it might well be. There's a lot of erratic stuff going on at the moment with the data, but some economists think that we may see a bit of a, if not a recession, then certainly a kind of period of flatlining for the next few quarters. But that's kind of logical, when you're trying to fight inflation, which is what the Bank of England has been trying to do. Mm-hmm. You do it via pain. You do it by hurting people. You do it by making it so that they don't have as much money left over after they paid their mortgages, that they don't have as much money to go out there and spend in the shops. And then when they don't have as much money to spend, they don't want to spend as much. And then shops and indeed producers cut their prices, or kind of cut their prices accordingly. That's kind of how it works. It's it's not rocket science, and that's what we are experiencing right now as an economy.
But I thought the problem in this country was productivity. I've been hearing about productivity as a problem from every major politician since time immemorial.
Yeah, it's that too. But I mean, yeah, that's you could have said that 10 years ago as well, and it's a problem. Jeremy Hunt, we did an interview with him last month, and he was talking about the UK being stuck in a low growth trap. And it was interesting because that formulation, I suspect, you'll hear that formulation coming back. We're stuck in this low growth. We're stuck in a trap, and we need to get out.
I know where you're going with that.
But the thing is, to be honest with you, it's not like the UK is radically different from most of the rest of Europe in facing this. I mean, Germany's a bit worse. France not dissimilar to the UK. We're just not as productive as we used to be. The US slightly better. I mean, they just, again, no one entirely can fathom why. The US just does have this stronger productivity record than Europe, and has done for quite some time. There are lots of interesting theories about why it might be, but there's no definitive answer. Maybe energy has something to do with it. You've got cheap energy in the US thanks to shale gas. But long story short, we're just not growing as much as we would hope at the moment. And so that means that, leaving aside all the stuff we just talked about with inflation and with interest rates, you're kind of talking about an economy which is ticking along, maybe not quite flatlining, but just going up incredibly gradually. And if then something happens that's going to cause a bit of a dent, and we're going through quite a big dent at the moment with interest rates, then you might be more likely than not to face a bit of a recession. But does it mean it's a kind of total disaster? Well, not necessarily, because this is, as I say, this is the painful medicine that has been doled out to try to keep prices down. And inflation is now, we can come to it, but inflation is now, doesn't look like it's peaked, and it's coming down. There may be another little bump when we get the latest data, which is, I think, next week. But nonetheless, it's still kind of heading in the direction that the Bank of England would be happy about. But in order to get there, it's taken a lot of pain, and interest rates going up so much higher than the bank had expected or anticipated only earlier this year.
Okay, but how closely linked then is what is happening with GDP, inflation, and those kind of big headline figures linked to what is happening in the employment market? I mean, more data out this week. We've seen the sharpest fall in employment since 2020, although still technically, we're doing pretty well in terms of overall employment. Unemployment is up, economic inactivity is up, and vacancies falling below 1 million for the first time in 25 months. Just from that snapshot, it doesn't sound like the healthiest labour market in the world.
No, and I think that paradoxically, the stuff that the Bank of England is most concerned about at the moment is the stuff that might sound the best out of the whole thing, because you've got all of that which is kind of not looking great for the labour market. Unemployment started to trend higher, and essentially all of these slightly recessionary signs. It's recessionary signs. But then at the same time, you've got quite high wage inflation. And they don't like the wage inflation, not because they don't like people getting more money. Well, do they actually? That's a good question.
I would have thought simply put, the more money we earn, the more money they take off us.
The governor has occasionally kind of put his foot in his mouth on this, just because framing it is incredibly difficult. Because what they're really concerned about at the bank is you get high inflation, and then all of us see that inflation and say, well, hang on, inflation's at nearly 10%. I think I deserve a wage increase that's similar. And then everyone goes out and asks for those wage increases, and that's rational. Of course, everyone's going to do it. They should be doing that if they've got self-respect individually. However, what happened in the 1970s was that you got this spiral effect where then, after the people got those slightly higher wages, then they spent a bit more, and then those shop prices kind of went up further, and then one was chasing the other, and you just never escaped from the inflation. The bank's terrified of that repeating itself.
Well, let's just pop in the figures just at this juncture then. Wages up by 7.8% May to July 2023, 8.5% actually when you include bonuses in that. Inflation for July running just less than 7%. So what is take those figures and explain the issue that comes from a situation in which our wages are rising higher than the price of goods. I would have thought that would be a good thing, because it means we've all got more money in our back pocket at the end of the month.
Well, no, because if your inflation is just constantly going to be really high and quite volatile, because everything is measured against inflation. Like, your standard of living, yes, okay, if your wages are going up by 8% all the time and inflation's going up by 7% all the time, then that's a 1% increase in your real earning power, all else equal. But the thing is that when you've got high inflation at that kind of rate, it does tend to kind of get more volatile, and then you see it yo-yoing all over the place. And first of all, you can't necessarily rely on the fact that inflation is going to stay lower than, your earnings. Secondly, it starts to do kind of perverse things in the economy. When inflation's really high, people, don't necessarily act it in a rational way. They might not want to invest. They might not want to save. They might not feel they can plan for the future because they have no idea what's going to happen to prices in the future. They can't. Then when you're going out to the shops, you see this all the time with the kind of historical episodes of hyperinflation. When people are having to change their prices so quickly that they're having to make kind of multiple price changes in a day, then society kind of breaks down pretty quickly after that. Now, clearly, we're not facing anything like that, but you have a kind of minor version of that throughout the economy, where if prices aren't doing predictable things, then people find it very difficult to plan for the future. All of us, businesses, households, and so on. So you get perverse stuff happening, and that's why everyone wants inflation. That the Goldilocks thing is inflation down to be kind of low and predictable. Now, in the past, that's been seen as being about 2% inflation. There's no inherent reason why that couldn't actually be 3% or maybe even 4%. And there's a lot of academics who would say actually maybe that makes sense. But nonetheless, lower than where we are at the moment, because when that gets into high territory, life just becomes volatile and unpredictable, and you just are not able to kind of function as well as a society and as businesses and households. So that's kind of why they're concerned about it on a fundamental basis. But it involves them having to try to persuade people not to ask for as big wage rises as they would do otherwise, even though you can see that's an incredibly unpopular thing to suggest. And you're suggesting people are making sacrifices, and you've already seen, the chief economist got into trouble over this. The governor has talked in terms that have upset people over this, especially given that they earn lots of money. They haven't asked for big pay rises at the bank, it should be said, but even so. But the concern for them is like you're running away with this 1970s thing. Now, I don't think we're seeing that. That's the good news. It doesn't look like we're...
Doesn't look like...
Well,
because no one can predict and no one can guarantee.
Welcome to economics. Welcome to... I'm being honest, I'm sure you can find plenty of people who will seem really confident and tantalisingly confident about this stuff, but then it turns out in a year's time it's all nonsense. But the reality is we're living in a world of uncertainty. And in that world of uncertainty, however, it doesn't look like we're stuck in quite the same misery as we got stuck into in the 1970s. So there is some good news here. It doesn't look like... There was the famous analogy that I really like about inflation was there was the German economist, Karl Otto Poll, who said that it's like toothpaste, okay? Inflation's like toothpaste. Very easy to squeeze out of the tube, but very difficult to get back in, okay? And
finally, an Ed Conway metaphor analogy that I can understand.
That's it. I've actually yet to use that in a TV piece, like with toothpaste, but, we're running out of time for that, aren't we?
Well,
but the point is that it hasn't kind of, it doesn't look like it. Maybe we have managed to get a bit of it back into the tube. But it's still really early days. And this is before you get to to me, the kind of more interesting thing, which is leaving aside all of the stuff at the moment. A lot of this is about energy, okay? So you've had this big energy price shock. It's really bad in particular for the UK because we're a big energy importer. We are these days, at least, after the North Sea has kind of peaked, and bad for a lot of Europe. Not so bad for America. When you look at these charts, it's basically American gas prices have been almost flat, or at least been relatively low, whereas ours have kind of gone through the roof. And as a result, America is, it's part of the reason why America's doing pretty well at the moment. But look beyond that kind of energy price story. And then there's another kind of longer-term inflation story, which I'm a bit more worried about, and other people, I don't think are worried enough about it, which is if we are moving to a new... People call it like a multipolar world. Like if we're moving into a new Cold War, where you have different blocks across the planet, so China, Russia, the US and Europe on another side, then that equates to globalization as we know it, essentially kind of prizing itself apart. Whereas in the past you could rely on ordering stuff from China and very quickly it would come to you, or indeed Russian gas and very quickly it would come to you. Now you're having to start to make it within your own territory or within your own block. And that, to me, spells a more expensive world because you're having to make more manufacturing plants, you're having to do stuff here rather than there, and we're a bit more expensive at doing stuff. And that, to me, spells quite long-term, stubborn, structural, as economists would call it, inflation. But that's way off in the future. You know, that's the next 10 years rather than the next few months.
There is an awful lot of concern right now relating to what's known as the triple lock, the way which is guaranteed pensions have risen, since 2010 by 14% in real terms. But the flip side to that is you look at what's happened to working age benefits. Those have decreased in real terms by 9%. This is not a situation that is going to be tenable in the long term, is it? Particularly if we're going to see wage inflation, the likes of which we've been describing 7.8% to July 2023.
Yeah, and as a result, you then have really high pensions increases, which is kind of what looks like is what we're heading for. It's the thing with this. Okay, it's a slightly more complex story, and it's not quite the story you think it is when you look at it at first. Okay, because first things first, yes, there is a really obvious kind of disparity between the way that we're treating those who are on benefits, those who are disadvantaged, those who are struggling, and those who are going to be future retirees. And I think that you know, there are some serious question marks over whether that's the right thing socially to do. The government is leaning into that. They think right now that by making, you know, benefits slightly less attractive, and you're going to hear more about them fiddling with that in the future to make them less attractive, that they can encourage more people into the workplace. But others would look at that and say that this is not being, you know, caring enough to people. It's not being supportive enough to people when they're in their hour of greatest need.
I mean, is there any evidence? Is there any evidence that playing around with the benefit system, and we've had universal credit being brought in, partly to simplify the system, but also partly, according to Ian Duncan-Smith, to kind of focus attention on getting people back into work? I mean, is there any evidence of that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, famous last words, because there could well be a kind of a study that's shown it within a micro sample. But when you look at the workforce as a whole, I mean, the big issue we have at the moment is there's a lot of people who are long-term unemployed. Well, not so, you know, it's called basically out of work. They're out of the workforce at the moment, economically inactive. And so, you know, that the government will say they are kind of trimming back on benefits or changing the benefits system in order to try to encourage people to get back into work, which is obviously a laudable goal for those who are capable of doing it if there is some perversity in the system, which means they're not. However, like you say, at the same time, and my impression is we're going to definitely hear more about that on the benefits side in the upcoming autumn statement and in the coming months. The government is from what I can glean from talking to people within Whitehall, are pushing at that. But at the same time, you've got what's happening with the triple lock. Now, it does look on the face of it like they are favouring kind of boomers and pensioners on the one hand over younger people and those who can't work on the other hand. However, it's worth just saying the people who most benefit from the triple lock are not those people who are retiring this year or next year. It's those who are retiring in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years' time, because these things build a lot more over time. And if you're increasing the state pension over a long period of time, the people who will most benefit from it are today's millennials, who will eventually retire
if it remains in place.
If it remains in place. But no, but even if it doesn't remain in place, and you just have a kind of, you know, a smaller thing in the future, a smaller increase in the future, at least having these big early increases means you've got a bigger amount to start with, and then you get that kind of appreciation over time. Which so you know, paradoxically, if you were to get rid of the triple lock, it will most affect not, you know, pensioners right now or indeed pensioners tomorrow, but pensioners, you know, in future decades. That's the irony here is it's actually not just for those who are of pension age right now. However,
then? Sorry, on you go.
Well, however, definitely it's something that is positive for those who are going to be future retirees versus something which is positive right now for those who are most in need, for those who are, you know, out of work and struggling to find a way to get back into the workforce and really trying and are reliant on universal credit or of the various other benefits that incapacity benefits. it's trimming back that stuff in favour of other spending elsewhere. And right now, once again, the government is trying to hit various fiscal targets that it set itself.
Aye.
And using that as the rationale,
and not doing desperately well at it. Look, what about that other one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse of the British economy? House prices. I mean, again, we're seeing them falling, declining at the fastest rate since 2009, which again, one would assume would be great news for those who are trying to get onto the property market, those who are at the bottom end of the market. But it will presumably have an effect on the Bank of England's decision about interest rates, which is fast approaching as well.
Well, it's caused by the Bank of England's decision on interest rates. And again, this bit is kind of not rocket science. What happens when the bank raises interest rates up to a rate where it's incredibly painful for those who are having to pay those mortgages? And it is incredibly painful. It's a pain that is more concentrated than it used to be, because actually fewer people these days pay mortgages than used to.
We've talked about this in the past. I mean, the situation in the 70s where, the amount of money that you were spending on your property was not 5 times your annual income.
No, it's worse now for those who have mortgages. But that's the critical bit of the phrase. It's for those who have mortgages. And back in the 70s, or indeed the 90s, the majority of people, who were owner occupiers had mortgages. Now the majority of people who are owner occupiers have paid off their mortgage, because it's typically kind of older people who have managed to pay it off over many years. And also that kind of understates it, because quite a lot of the chunk, 40-something% of owner occupiers with mortgages, quite a lot of that chunk are people whose mortgages they're going to pay off in about 5 years' time. And so by now, they're really quite small. So the pain is quite concentrated among people, particularly younger people, particularly those living in cities who have had to try and pay a lot to try and get on the housing ladder. There's going to be a lot of pain for those people. But as I say, it's not rocket science. When you do this at the Bank of England, you expect it to have an impact. They will have expected house prices to come down. They don't like talking about it, but they will have expected house prices to come down. And there's probably further for them to go. And also, frankly, that may not be any bad thing, because house prices are incredibly high in this country as a percentage of your potential income. And it's better if they're more affordable. Ideally, you'd be doing it by building more homes in places where people need the houses as well, which is an issue. The planning system in this country isn't very friendly to that. But yeah, I thought, the difficulty is, I think we as a nation have got better at this. There was a period where people, front pages of newspapers would all be like, house prices going gangbusters, great news. And then have house prices where, if there was a housing crash, it was like, this is terrible news. We need to kind of be more grown up about it.
Okay.
Often, actually, it's not good news or bad news at all. But more people being able to get a home and own their home is a good thing, and it's been very difficult in this country.
Okay, but we'll put it all into some kind of context for us then, Ed, if you can. Okay, house prices are on their way down, wages outstripping inflation, and we think we're seeing inflation starting to top out now, and perhaps even be, let's keep our fingers crossed, maybe even coming down. Some pretty worrying news in terms of employment across the board, and GDP again down across the board. Let's not forget the fact we've got public sector strikes still ongoing. We're seeing businesses like Wilko collapsing, and we've got this interest rate decision in the immediate future. How concerned are you about the prospect of recession, the one we mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast?
I think it's a very real possibility. I think that the definition of recession, what's the technical definition of recession, is 2 successive quarters of the economy contracting. It's an arbitrary definition. Someone came up with that, I can't remember when, it was in the 70s or something, and for some reason it's stuck, and now we fixate and obsess over that. But the reality is, even if there's not a recession, when you look at pretty much any of the forecasts you're seeing from the Bank of England, from independent forecasters, from basically anyone, the UK economy is just flatlining, not just for a few months or a few quarters, but for years. And you look out into the future, and you have potentially been through, in many senses, kind of a lost decade or a lost decade and a half, where you're turning it into kind of 2 lost decades. And that's desperately concerning. And this, I mean, I think the answer, well, part of the answer to this is something that you and I have talked about a little bit, because I'm not here to puff the book I wrote, but I'm a bit obsessed with how we
have
make
a go anyway. Have a go anyway.
It's just how we make stuff and how we kind of get towards the net zero goals that we've set ourselves, and that, it turns out, is a massive opportunity for the global economy to be able to try and come up with some ways of making abundant energy that we can all benefit from. There are lots of exciting areas out there that the UK could be investing in, but at the moment there's been such a kind of a cloud over this economy, and a lot of Europe as well. It's not just UK specific stuff, but things like some of the domestic policy, the kind of cycling through prime ministers, cycling through chancellors, Brexit. A lot of the different kind of policy choices that have happened in the UK haven't added to people's enthusiasm to invest in those potentially exciting areas in the UK. However, that is starting potentially to lift. And so I think that although the forecasts are for this flatlining, there are kind of areas out there where you can see a little bit of hope, whether it's AI, whether it's various different kind of green technologies, there's other things besides, new material science. So there are kind of reasons for being optimistic about the future. And my hope is that the economists, we started the conversation talking about economics, and that, the predictions of the future are inherently kind of impossible. My hope is that they've just got it wrong again, and that there will be some productivity leaps yet to come. But that being said, if you'd made that prediction 5, 10, 15 years ago, you'd have been completely wrong. So, I retain the right to be very wrong on that.
Yeah, same here. Oh, by the way, I believe it was Julius Shishkin from the US Bureau of Labour Statistics who in 1974 came up with the technical definition of recession.
Well, Julius has a lot to answer for, because, it's not a good thing.
I'll drop him a line after this. Ed Conway, thanks very much, as always. And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you next time.